everything they believed in was quite different from the things I was brought up to believe in. So he, in fact, includes in the document a letter that he wrote for his children, my father and my aunt, to be opened in the event of my grandparents' deaths if they were to die in the war. And what he wrote to them, so this is in the early 40s when they were children, he wrote, "What it's important for you to know is that we are Mediterranean, we are Latin, we are Catholic, we are French," in that order. And I am a North American, non-practicing Protestant.
The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Hello, Claire.
Hello, Souvankham. Thank you for doing this with me. It's such a treat.
It's so lovely to meet this way. I don't know, Claire. This is the first time we're meeting.
We met half an hour ago.
Yes. I wonder if we might start speaking about the novel's beginnings for you. Like, as a writer, I had read that it was bits and pieces of it was inspired by a document that your grandfather recorded for you and your sister. I'm particularly interested in what you do with that document in order to arrive at a work like this, because I too had a document that my father had kept when we were living in a refugee camp. And he threw it out, but I had kept it for many years privately for myself. And I wrote a poetry book about it. So I'm really curious as to what do you do with your emotional attachment to the document itself, and how do you move from that document into making it all up as a novel?
These questions about what a wonderful question. How to answer it? I think so. So my grandfather, in his retirement, wrote by hand. It's very long. It's 1,500 pages. It's not all handwriting. It's also including photographs and telegrams and letters and train ticket stubs and all kinds of stuff. And he spent, I think, probably 5 or 6 years in the 1970s writing that. And because he was very orderly, it's neatly written with the page numbers and the margins when he wrote it. So you know that this bit was written on May 12th, 1973, and this bit was written on May 16th. And it's such a substantial document, and it covers the years 1928 when my grandparents married to 1946, which is just after the end of the war. And I had read little bits and pieces long ago. He had some of it typed up so that he could share it with us. But the vast majority of it I hadn't read until 2017 when I had to leave from teaching, and I sat down and read the whole thing from beginning to end. And already then I knew I wanted to write something that was related to or inspired by family history. But I didn't know what shape it might take. And when I read the memoir, which is full of wonderful stories, just sort of some of it, gossip, right? About their friends or about experiences. Who knew there was a lot of, he was the naval attaché in Beirut, the French naval attaché in Beirut before the war. My grandparents were very devout Catholics, but apparently, they were invited to a lot of wife-swapping dinners. Who knew? It was pretty lively in Beirut in the 30s, I guess. So, you learned all sorts of stuff you didn't expect to know. But then the question, like, what do you what do you do with it, and how, as you say, sort of the emotional, all the feelings that you have reading it. I think for me there was this. So this is maybe not quite answering your question, but it was a big thing. So he wrote it obviously in French, and my mother was from Toronto, Anglophone Canadian. My parents spoke English together. We grew up speaking English in the household. We learned French, my sister and I. I went to the French school here for a time, but funnily enough, the French that I know is my grandfather's French. Right, so there was this funny thing that there would be in French perhaps things, reading something like, if I'm reading Proust, I have to look some words up, but reading my grandfather's memoir, I didn't have to look anything up because the words fit in my head. The syntax the syntax seemed completely normal to me. So it was this extraordinary thing that he was also writing to us, even though he wrote it when we were children, he was writing it to us as adults. And at one point he says, it'll probably be 30 years before you read this. So for me, it was like my grandfather who died in 1998, as if he were in the room with me the whole time I was reading it. And that was a really wonderful experience. But then the question of what does that have to do, if anything, with what I might write? And for me, I think making things, for one thing, it became clear to me that I was interested in a bigger arc, much bigger arc than the time that he had written about, and that time was part of the story for me, the passage of time, and how time changes things. So then, in a way, it became a starting point, that document. But I took only a very there's probably a few pages that I then imagined scenes and then sort of embarked from there. The other thing I might say, he called it Everything We Believed In. That's what he titled his memoir for us. And one of the reasons I was interested in time is because I realized that everything they believed in was quite different from the things I was brought up to believe in. So he, in fact, includes in the document a letter that he wrote for his children, my father and my aunt, to be opened in the event of my grandparents' deaths if they were to die in the war. And what he wrote to them, so this is in the early 40s, when they were children, he wrote, "What it's important for you to know is that we are Mediterranean, we are Latin, we are Catholic, we are French," in that order. And I am a North American, non-practicing Protestant. So everything we believed in is sort of a long way. And I suddenly realized that was true of the world that I was brought up in, that the world that my kids were had come into somewhere along the line, and quite suddenly the world that I had been brought up to believe was coming was very different from their world. And I think I'm talking a blue streak. I'm sorry to become quiet in a second, but that I was, I think, in a post-war way, my after the war, which was so terrible, people were willfully optimistic and wanting to rebuild a world in a hopeful way. Obviously, with massive problems, we wouldn't be where we are now if without that. But that it was a world that believed that certainly my parents brought me up to believe that borders would recede, that that hybridization and cosmopolitanism, internationalism was the way of the future. And I think for a long time we could believe that was happening, and the last 10 years, it's sort of harder to believe that. So the world that my kids have grown up, they're 20 and 22, the world they've grown up into is maybe as far from what I believed growing up was coming as my grandparents' world is from mine.
Thank you for that.
Sorry, that was a long speech.
I want us to turn to, you were talking about time. There are, in the novel, there are many voices that span across time. There are children's voices, teenagers' voices, adult voices, and elderly voices. And they're all within the same family. And you do this marvelous thing with voice where you can hear their age in the way that they sound on the page. You make them you make their voices so vivid. It was such a joy and a marvel to be in the presence of a voice that moves through time in that way. And I wondered if you would indulge us and read, for those who are here, the sound of a voice.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. So this is the novel is divided in, there's sort of, it happens over 7 decades. There's a section, there's a sort of 7 decades each with several perspective sections within that. And then there's a prologue and an interlude and an epilogue as well. So this that I'm about to read is from the interlude, so it's in the middle of the book. It's in the it's 1978. It's the grandparent characters, Gaston and Lucienne Cassard, that's their names. It's their 50th wedding anniversary, and there's a big party. So that's, I'll read just a couple of pages from there. But wait, what was that in the older Gaston's happy speech, joyous evening, even that next evening at the hotel in front of all the guests, the 50 friends and relatives in the hotel dining room, everyone sated by rack of lamb and little sheaves of carrots and green beans, a wee round tower of yellow rice on every plate, the wine a fine rosé from neighboring Bandol, sweating in bulbed bottles on the tables and in their glasses, their gilded chairs pulled back from the white tables, soiled by crumbs and sauces, belts and collars loosened, high heels abandoned akimbo beneath the dangling tablecloths, women wiggling their numb toes, the floral centerpieces wilting, the littler children tearing up and down the carpeted hallway outside under the watch of a pair of deputed fathers with bloodshot eyes, the aura fully that of the end of the wedding, a combination of exhaustion and inertia in the guests who wished now to be at home but hadn't quite the energy to rise from their chairs and make for home or their hotel rooms, everyone feeling at once wistful and relieved that this long-planned event so looked forward to was suddenly over, in the past, a memory already, but didn't it go off well? The catering a success, the hotel well chosen, the cake a splendid and delectable croque en bouche, its golden sponge sugar tower decorated with real flowers, something that back in El Biar they might only have dreamed of, was delicious, its profiteroles fresh and moist, its crème pâtissière divine, but we really shouldn't have had that last bite, that last glass. How to leave when who knew when they'd next be reunited, the cousins from Pau, from Lyon, from Brest, some who'd not seen each other in over 25 years, was at last at the apartment of the Cousine Brelou near the Place du Gouvernement? It must have been in 59, no? They ended up in Alsace, of all places, those 3 old spinsters. Is the last one, Laure, still alive? Gaston would know. Wasn't it their mother who condemned the marriage? That was always what we were told. Or was it even earlier, the funeral of Tata Baudry, the midwife in Larba, who lived to be over 90, dear thing, God rest her soul. You know, Gaston credits her with his whole life. It was she who paid his fees for the lycée and the boarding too, after his mother committed to them without a penny of her own, mad woman, a single mother, and at the time just a substitute teacher, can you imagine, in the elementary school in Blida. But that little old lady, Tata Baudry, wizened like a nut. She'd saved and saved for those 2 kids of hers whose lives were so disastrous, the son Émile, who got in trouble with the law and fled to Brazil, where he changed his name to Edouard Garcin and died young in 1930. Her letter returned to sender from the hospital Villa Curupiti in Rio de Janeiro. And the daughter, Auguste, unfortunate girl, never married, could never hold a job. She lived off her mother. She too died young of a lung complaint, we think. And for what did Tata Baudry work so hard delivering babies, village babies, country babies, Muslim, Christian, Berber, Arab, French, Spanish, Italian, Maltese, all babies loved by her brown hands. And when she was paid money, she saved her coins so she could give them to her relatives. She paid for Gaston's schooling, then she helped to pay for their wedding, and still later helped them buy their first furniture for the apartment in Toulon, Boulevard Léon Bourgeois, where François was born. Yes, that rather heavy-set bald fellow over there smoking. Without Tata Baudry, none of this would have been possible. Sage femme indeed, and she was honored on this night. Gaston spoke of her and thanked her, and they toasted, even if not by name, all the others who had gone before. Lucienne's eldest sister, Fay, who became the headmistress of the Teachers' College, and Constantine, though her own father couldn't read, and Josephine Sébille, their mother, who married Sposito, and with him bought the business in Castiglione from old Malacan in Enviager, the inn and restaurant known as the Hôtel de Lorient, with its vineyards, all that they would later lose on account of deceitful Constant Cassard. He too was there, behind the toasts, invisible, all of it a world now dusty and faded, the worn memories of the parents, of most guests, or grandparents even, of another time long before their time. These two, the last of a lost generation, and she, poor thing, still so pretty, even approaching 90, but she must be. She was born in the 19th century, something like 1892. Yes, it's true, a massive difference between them, 13 years, is it? Must have been quite the scandal at the time. But what did he say? What did he say?
When I first read that passage, I was so thrilled as a writer to encounter it, to allow the question, what did he say? What did he say? And to not tell us. I thought, wow, that's power. I wonder if you could maybe talk about that, like the decision not to write it out or to explain what did he say.
So there is a sort of family secret that emerges eventually, and I mean, it's a little complicated because for him it's not, for Gaston it's not a secret,
Yeah.
but for others in the family it's something that they don't talk about, and I think that's the what I would say, I suppose, is when I'm teaching undergraduates, which I do a lot of the time, I always say to them, you know, it's a distinction that E.M. Forster makes between plot and story, which is not quite as I would think of it if I were to hear those two words in my head. He speaks of story as the events in chronological order, and the plot as the making of meaning out of those events. So the way he describes it is, the story is the king died, the queen died. The plot is the king died, the queen died of grief, right? So it's the motivation, it's the reason for something happening. But one of the ways that as writers we show, we make meaning is sometimes by telling things not in order, right? Is by the arrangement of the events that we tell. And the example that I give to my students, I'll share with you tonight, is as I think about Germany. The first thing, maybe not younger people now, but the first thing in my generation that I knew about Germany was World War II. And so everything else is filtered through that first knowledge. But imagine if the first thing you knew was Goethe or Beethoven or many kinds of sausage, right? Like if you knew different things and only later on knew about the war. But as it is, everything you think you learn about Goethe and you already know about the war, so you think, well, yes, already world domination was on their minds, you know, in 1800, you know. So that's one of the things that I wanted in this novel was for the reader to have one experience that might also alter eventually as certain other things change. And part of it for me is trying to convey how differently over time people understand the same things. And I think that's something that right now, looking again at my children's generation, there isn't a sort of immediate sense of how the world looked different to people in a different time and place. And of course, our world will look different to people in 20 or 30 years or 50 years. Our world will look completely different again.
There's a moment in the novel where Barbara's children say to her, just leave him, Mom. But she doesn't. And I've always thought that leaving someone could sometimes be an act of true love, because you release yourself and the other person. Two unhappy people could actually become four happy people. But then reading your novel, I wondered if maybe wanting to leave and not doing so is an act of true love. Like to hold and to remind this person that you have this choice, but you're not going to choose it. Is that something that you were thinking of in?
I think, I guess I'm a great believer in the overdeterminedness of everything, and that love and hate can be in the same room at the same time, in the same moment even, and so I think, yes, I absolutely think that both things can be acts of love, and can be acts of the opposite of love or of not love at the same time. So it's there's a quote from an Anthony Pohl novel that I used as an epigraph for an earlier novel of mine. It's not what happens; it's what you think happens that matters. And I really believe that sort of sense of. I guess I believe that what we think happens or what we think has happened, that can change too, and so yes, all things are possible. I hope it's love too.
There's lots that is said about home that is literal, physical, like the brick, the wall, the structure, but also the city, the geographical location, but also the flesh itself. Would you say that, I guess because I'm thinking of the last word in the novel, which has to do with language, and I wonder if you think that language also is a kind of home.
Absolutely. I feel you should speak about this too. I think it's such an interesting question, living across cultures, in multiple cultures, in multiple languages, and that question of what is home. How language is a home for people, and how that might change. I think that so this is a story of a family, but it seems to me so much a story of the 20th and 21st century, people moving, migrating, changing, not ending up where they started. We lost Alice Munro today, but she was someone who was home, and where she lived was home. and she knew where she was from to bedrock, and that's an amazing thing, and it's part of one of the many things that's so powerful in her work. And I feel like for many of us, we didn't get that. That wasn't the gift that we got. There's an essay by Salman Rushdie, now an old essay from the 80s, called Imaginary Homelands, where he writes about how as soon as you leave home, the home that you have is imaginary, and you can't go back to the place that you were, because it's in time it changes, and the place that you go back to is not the place that you remember. And I think for many of us that's the case. I have to say I hadn't been to Toronto since before the pandemic, and heck, it's looking really different to me, you know, and that's not that long, and so home then becomes something else, and home becomes people, and home becomes language too. And maybe the last thing I would just say about language is, you know, I mentioned earlier, so my father was French. He grew up speaking French. My parents met speaking English, and so they spoke English together. My aunt, I mean, this is a thing that's in the novel, and much of the novel is fiction, but my aunt wanted very much, she was very religious, my parents were not. She wanted him to have the last rites, and he didn't want to, and then he acceded because he wanted to please his sister, and he said to me, "Is there someone who could do it in French?" Because for him, the time that the Catholic faith was meaningful to him, the thing that it would speak, it only had meaning in French, and it didn't have meaning in English. And that's a moment of language being home. But it's also true that his life with us, and we were his home too, that was a life in English. So he had both of those things.
I speak like Lao, but like a 2-year-old. And when I speak it, I can only speak it to my parents, because they allow me the vocabulary of a 2-year-old. Whereas with other people, I don't seem articulate or know what I'm talking about because I sound like a 2-year-old in that language. But with my family, I know that they're family because I'm allowed to sound like that.
Right.
Now, I don't want to give anything away, of course, but I love surprises. And I wonder, do you plan surprises, or are they a surprise to you as well as you are making it up?
Wow, Souvankham, that's a really tough question. I don't know. Do you plan surprises?
No, otherwise it wouldn't. I feel like a reader could see it. If it wasn't a surprise to me, I think a reader who reads closely or not, I think I would give it away accidentally. So it has to be a surprise to me.
Yeah. Isn't there a way? I sometimes feel as though the writing fiction is sometimes like visiting a town for which you have some sort of a map, but the difference between looking at a map and being in the town is quite significant. Not Google Earth. I don't mean Google Earth. I mean, like, actually you have an old-fashioned map and then you visit the town. And so I feel as though it's full of surprises, because it's like you might see on the map that there's a little square, but then you round the corner and it's like, oh, that's the square. and there's that fountain in the middle, and look at that, you know, and you couldn't have foreseen it, but it also then seems inevitable. And that seems to me always part of the joy of writing fiction, because if you knew how it was going to be, why would you bother, right?
Yeah.
Like so you know, I always felt that about essays in college. Like if you've done all the notes, like couldn't you just give the professor the notes? Because right, like the paper, the rest is just kind of brr. But the fiction you're making it up, or it's coming to you. However, whatever that experience is.
I'm thinking of what you said earlier about plot and story. And I'm thinking about, you know, we don't think it's a story to just walk across the street to go to the corner store. But then what if we reveal that the person who did that is 2 years old?
Right.
Right, yeah. So that little introduction, that little twist changes what is considered ordinary. And I think an ability to work with the ordinary is the trick, to be able to deal with the ordinary.
I'm reminded of somebody, a writer friend, speaking about how we think of certain things as bad dialogue, but there's no bad dialogue necessarily. It's about so with dialogue, you know, again, the teaching thing, I'm always saying to students, like, you don't have to say hi, how you doing, good, you, like, cut that, just cut to the chase. But of course, this writer friend was saying, but if actually you're conveying some terrible awkwardness between people who wouldn't normally live in this banal register, and you put the banal register, you put in, hi, how you doing, good, you, when actually, you know, they're estranged siblings who haven't spoken for 10 years, then suddenly this thing that seems as though it's like crossing the street and going to the store and it being a 2-year-old. It's like almost anything can be meaningful. The most ordinary things can be meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And to get us to that end, we have to want to read the sentences about walking to the store,
Right.
to encounter the surprise, which brings me to my own personal love of your novels. So I don't have a large family, and when I was reading your novel, I was laughing and I was like, this is why I don't and I'm so glad I don't. You know, the cooking of the meals, the entertaining the guests, people coming in and out, revolving doors, just the noise. But then when I finished the novel, I began to weep because I realized how alone I was, not having family. And just having spent like 400 pages with a family, I felt like you gave me family. And I'm just so grateful.
Thank you. I'm gonna get a little misty. That's, I mean, what a beautiful thing to say. And it's a funny, you know, people have said, oh, because I've not written about my family, I've not written autobiographically before. And there's fiction. I mean, I was saying to you earlier, Souvankham, like I think of it, this isn't literally my family. It's a fictional family. It's sort of like papier mâché, right? There's a form, and then you kind of put a lot of gluey newspaper around it. It becomes something else. But there is this thing. You know, my parents and my grandparents aren't living, and is it somehow still, is it, everybody's always, young people are always asking, like, I want to write about my family. Can I do that? Should I do that? Am I, and it's a tough one. It's a tough one. And then they're not living, and you think, can I do that? And in this case, for me, it was entirely an act of love. And I couldn't have written this book earlier, because 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, maybe I would have tried to write such a book, and these people would have been only my family to me. Mm-hmm. And so the frustration that I felt at my father who was an alcoholic, or the disappointment I felt at my mother's inability to stand up for herself, or those things would have colored, would have shaped the novel. And instead I felt, reading what my grandfather wrote, and then these letters from my parents to each other before I was born, and they were people just like me, and trying, and full of love and hope and disappointment. And all I feel for them is so much love, And I think there are writers who, like Chekhov is a writer. When I read him, I feel that love for all his characters. And sorry, I'm a little, but I think that's my that's the spirit in which I wrote this book. And so not precisely not the love of secrets and lies, and like nobody is bad-tempered and nobody has faults and everybody is shiny and happy, but the love of, like, it's all okay. It's all okay. All shall be well. So.